Hey, are you as confused as I am? What are journals doing? Why are some things in the paper, other things are not in the paper? My niece was telling me what was going on in her school. That's not in the paper. My co-worker was telling me what's going on in the office downtown. Car crashes that he saw, something happening at the bank, that's not in the paper. My uncle was telling me what's happening in his neighborhood, what his friends are doing outside, walking along the beach. That's not in the paper, but these other things are in the paper. What's going on? How do journalists decide what to put in the paper, what not to put in the paper? Let's try to figure this out. Why don't we start with a general definition? Inside the word news, of course, is the word new. So mostly news is events that have just happened, or perhaps happened earlier today, or happened yesterday. More rarely, it could include events that happened some days ago, months ago, years ago, even millions of years ago, but simply hasn't been reported before, hasn't been revealed to the public before, and so thus is worth reporting. So if someday some scientist discovers evidence of what really happened to the dinosaurs, that's a story of many, many, many years ago. That story happened, but the discovery is what is new. Now, it must be not only new, the story, but it must have other characteristics. The story must be also interesting or important to many people. Now, it's important to note that we say to many people. It shouldn't be a story that's interesting or important only to you or to your friends or to your colleagues, your office workers, colleagues, but to a wide group of people. So if we put all this together, news is information about events that haven't happened before, not been reported before, that journalists filter and disseminate. They make the decisions based on their judgments, and they disseminate or spread them to the public because the public considers them important or interesting. If we break this down further, we can think of news as consisting of those stories that have what we call news values. And here we've listed 7 of them. Impact, conflict, unusual, famous, human interest, useful, and entertaining. Why don't we break them down further a little bit? Impact, a very important news value. You'll see on the front page all the time. Impact means the event affected people. And the more people that it affects, the greater the story is usually, right? So accidents, natural disasters, and so on. Here's an example of food crisis in Nigeria, impact on 4.5 million people. A typhoon in Taiwan, impact very immediate on the lives of many, many people. So every day we see political and economic stories get lots of space in the news media, because often these kinds of stories have big impacts on people's lives. Conflict and controversy is another very important news value. Often it's mixed with stories of impact also have conflict and controversy. That combination often dominates the front pages. Now, conflict means the kinds of stories where we talk about people disagreeing, where people argue or clash over something. Arguments, disputes, debates, controversies. And conflict and controversy makes news because it disrupts life. It has impact on people. It makes us cringe, fear, makes us worried, forces us to pay attention. It forces us to stop what we're doing. Here's an example on the right. David Lee was the president of the Bank of East Asia here in Hong Kong. This is a story from the South China Morning Post. he presided over a shareholders meeting. And normally, as this story points out, shareholders meetings are pretty routine and calm affairs. Here it says in the story, such meetings, most people go to these meetings mainly for the dim sum and the soft drinks, not by anything else. But it turns out that at this particular shareholders meeting, it didn't turn out to be a normal one, because an investor started grabbing the mic and started scolding David Lee for his fundraising plans. So if this scolding, this grabbing of the mic never happened, the reporter would probably have written nothing, because the shareholders meetings, as we said, are routine. But this happened, and it became a story. So you can see how once you inject conflict into an event, it could become news. Here's a story I wrote some years ago. I was covering Cambodia. The man you see is Khieu Samphan in his later years. Khieu Samphan was one of the leaders of the Khmer Rouge, which was a communist group in Cambodia, which ruled Cambodia in the 1970s, and during their rule of almost 4 years, they were responsible for the deaths of more than 1 million people through slave labor camps, executions, and so on. After they were overthrown, Khieu Samphan was the de facto, you could say, spokesman, foreign minister for the Khmer Rouge, and he basically traveled around the world trying to defend the Khmer Rouge record. And each time, during all of his appearances, he'd basically make the same speech, present the same excuses. So one time he was scheduled to appear at a function at a hotel in Bangkok. I went there, of course, just in case something would happen, but basically expecting him to give the same old speech again. However, this time, as he was talking, I heard a woman shouting from the back, "He's a killer, he's a liar," and shaking her fist. He blamed her. She blamed him for the murder of many of her relatives in the 1970s. And as soon as I heard this, of course, I jumped up and went to the back to try to go and interview her. So you can see again, if this had been another routine Khieu Samphan speech, I probably would have written nothing. But because this happened, I wrote a story. And the conflict is right in the lead of the story. The woman interrupted him at an international conference on Saturday, shouting, "He's a killer, he's a liar." Unusual. That is another very important news value. By unusual, we mean those events that are rare, astonishing, bizarre. Yeah? When you hear about it, you think, "Oh my God, I never heard of such a thing." So in journalism, we often say, when a dog bites a man, it is not news. But when a man bites a dog, it is news. So you can feel a bit sorry for me. Here's a picture. I was actually bitten by a dog some years ago. I felt it was news, but of course it really isn't news. Nobody thinks of it as news. I should have bitten a dog. That's what, if I wanted to be in the paper. And that's exactly what this guy did in Staten Island, which is in New York in the U.S. This guy bit his dog, or that cute little thing, on the ear, and he claimed he did it because he was just expressing his love for the dog. The court didn't agree. He was sentenced to community service. Here's another unusual story. A mother of 3 has a disease called chloephobia, which is a fear of newspapers. People who have this disease can't stand to be around newspapers. They can't stand the sight of newspapers. They can't stand the presence of newspapers. They can't stand the smell of newspapers. It makes them sick, scared, right? I hope none of you have this disease. Also in the unusual category are those EST types of stories, right? The tallest, the smallest, the longest, the heaviest, etc. So here we have the tallest woman. Next news value, famous and prominent. So these are people, they are news because we're naturally, meaning society, are naturally interested in people who are famous or prominent. Whatever they say or do may be minor, or what is said about them or people do to them may be minor, but is still news simply because of who they are, because our attention as human beings naturally zero in on them. Now, famous and prominent are related, of course, but they're slightly different things. You know? Famous means I mention the name of the person and people know immediately who I'm talking about. So many of these people are entertainers or athletes or best-selling authors, rich and powerful people. And it's not just people. We could also have famous places and famous things. You know? Prominent, and you can see on the right there's the Pope, one of the most famous people in the world. And the Pope is in the news today because he broke his wrist. Okay, and he recovered very quickly, nothing serious, but it's still news because he's the Pope. Prominent, a bit different. Prominent means somebody whose name is not well known. You mention the name and many people would not recognize the name. You know? But that person holds some leading position. Right? By leading position, I mean that person has control perhaps over people or resources. Right? And that's why people pay attention to them. So some examples are government officials, police officials, university officials, people usually in positions of leadership of an institution. Now, normally, I told you that normally when a dog bites a man, it is not news because it's very common. Yeah. However, if the dog there's some famous or prominent element here, then it could very well be news. Here we have an example of dog biting a man becoming news because the dog was prominent. The dog belonged to a famous person, and the biting took place at a famous place. Right? This is Barney. He was the dog of President George W. Bush of the U.S., and the biting of a Reuters reporter took place at the White House lawn. Take a look. But you don't need to feel too sorry for the Reuters reporter. You know, I worked at the AP, and I know AP is a much superior news service. So, bite Reuters again, Barney. Take a look.
Nap time for her.
Hey, you doing?
You good boy.
Ooh.
Did he get you?
You alright?
He totally got me.
Did he?
Yeah,
Oh my
totally.
God.
Totally broke my skin. Well, now I have.
He's
story
not
to tell.
happy today.
See, you can't put your hands in his face.
Okay. Oh, Barney.
Barney.
Hi, Barney. Be
Bye, bye,
good.
bye, bye.
Bye, Barney. Bye, Barney. Okay. On this day, you have a great story to tell. What is your story?
Well, on this day, April Ryan of American Urban Radio, I got bit by Barney.
Oh,
and
God.
unfortunately, it broke the skin, and I have to be on antibiotics for the next few days.
Now, who told you this? Because you got it wrapped up. Let me see. Let me get the finger first.
Yeah. The White House physician, Dr. Tubb, bandaged me up and made certain that the finger's taken care of, but for now, I have to make certain that I continue to bandage this, wash it daily, and take antibiotics for the next few days.
And what happened? You just saw Barney like we typically do. We see him and we just want to talk to him. And
Yeah, I just wanted to pet Barney. My mom has a Scottish Terrier. I wanted to pet Barney, and unfortunately, he was not in the mood to be pet.
Our next news value, human interest. These are stories that stir emotions in readers, deep and real emotions. Be very careful about this term because it does not mean stories that humans are interested in. It means when I read the story, I feel deep, real, sincere emotion because of something that happened in the story, mostly to people. The reader, will feel joy, pity, sympathy, sadness, hope, hopelessness, inspiration, pessimism, optimism. So many of these stories are stories about heroic deeds, tragedies, survival against great odds, and many of them happen to animals and children because people consider them to be vulnerable and sympathize with their plight. On the right, you can see a couple of examples, right? Divided Koreas, that's a story about families that were divided after the Korean War in the 1950s. They were never allowed to see each other, never allowed even to phone or write letters to each other when the peninsula broke up into North and South. And reunions were allowed only in recent years, and you could see brothers and sisters, daughter and mother reuniting just for a few minutes, and then they have to separate and they'll never see each other again in their lives. On the bottom, Siamese twins from Iran, joined at the head, underwent a major operation, a very risky operation in Singapore. And people who didn't even know them gathered at the hospital, waiting for word of the operation because they so sympathized with their plight. You know, unfortunately, the women died on the operating table from too much blood loss. You know, one of the women wanted to become a lawyer. You know what the other woman wanted to become? A journalist. Yeah. So much did they want to pursue their own careers and live separate lives, become a lawyer, become a journalist, that they were willing to undergo this very risky surgery. Unfortunately, they died. Next news value, useful, practical. These are stories that contain information that answers a question about your life or solves a problem that you're facing, or has information that you can use to do something. Sometimes we call these stories news you can use. You can find this in these kinds of stories in the food section, weather, health, education, personal finance, IT, investment, travel. So here's some bad news for you. Dim sum is not so good for the heart. Lots of salt, lots of fat, so don't eat too much. Couple more examples from health and from personal finance. So information that you can use to protect your life, to make your life better. And finally, there's entertaining news. Yeah. Stories that we read simply to pass the time, to have fun, for enjoyment, relief from all the dark things that are happening in the world. So these could be, you would find these in the movie section, sports section, music section, travel section, food section, and so on. These could also be light, funny stories like the one on the right here about the Japanese zoo. They got 2 hyenas 2 years ago, donated, and when they were donated, they were told there was a male-female couple. So the Japanese zoo put them in cages together, wanted them to make a baby, you know. But all this time they noticed that they never went through any breeding behavior. Instead, they were fighting each other all the time. Yeah. And so somebody decided after several years of this to take a closer look. They did an MRI, hormone test. What did they find out? No wonder they're both male. Now, many of the biggest stories have more than one news value. And the more news values, often the bigger the story is. 2 news values that often mix together, combine, to dominate the front pages of the paper are impact and conflict. And that seems to be true all over the world. stories with multiple news values. Example, Miss Japan, the title won by a woman of Indian heritage, right? And some people didn't like the fact that a Miss Japan was won by an ethnic minority, right? That she was not, quote unquote, a proper Japanese. So this story has the values of unusual, conflict, famous, and entertaining. Now, besides the 7 news values, there are also 2 factors that I should mention that affect, they are not news values as such, but they affect the news values. One is timeliness. Right? Timeliness is the idea that you should report the news as quickly as possible after it happens because this is what readers and audiences expect. They want it, they heard that it happened now, they want you to give us the details now. Their interest, and thus the value of the story, diminishes, lessens over time. If you wait too long, then audiences will no longer find it useful or interesting. For example, if it's investment news, if you wait too long, the buying opportunity is gone. If it's a bad storm coming into the city, right, they have less time to prepare if you wait too long. Right? And timeliness is something that's become more and more important in recent years because of technology. Technology like satellite TV, of course, the internet, has created expectations in people that journalists should be delivering the news pretty much as soon as it happens or right after it happens. The other factor that significantly affects the news values is what we call proximity, and also known as local angle. There are 2 types of proximity or local angle. One is geographical. That means the story happens in or near where I live, I being the reader, right? So people are naturally interested in things that are close to them geographically. So, and if the further away something happens, the bigger that story has to be if it is to be of interest to me. In other words, if it is to be of news to me. Proximity can also be psychological as opposed to geographical. That means that I'm interested in a story even if it takes place geographically very far away, if people who are similar to me are involved. Now, how are people similar to you? They could be similar to you in race, nationality, place of residence, right? And when we have this commonality, then you have an emotional tie with that person, a common sense of identity, because of a common background, a common culture, right? And so we're naturally, as human beings, interested in people who are like us. And that is psychological proximity. Some examples: motorcycle crash reported by a Hong Kong media. The crash happened on a Hong Kong highway. That's geographical proximity. I am interested in this story because it happened at a place very close to me. Example of psychological proximity. Right? This is a Hong Kong media reporting this. It happened in another country, 2.5 hours away by plane. But even though it happened far away from Hong Kong, I'm interested in it because a man who I identify with whom I share a common nationality and race, was involved. Why is it important then, in summary, to be clear about the news values so we can avoid writing all these things? Now, besides the 7 news values and the 2 factors, there's other determinants. There's other things that determine what today's news will be. Here is a list of some of them. There are many others. You can think about this and find some examples on your own. So the next time you're lost in that jungle of information out there, make sure you bring some insecticide and a list of these 7 news values and the 2 factors. Hack away at the dead leaves, get rid of the noise, the things that are not news, and then finally we'll be able to see the light, the story that is worth reporting. Happy news hunting.